Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to IISS. My name's Nigel Inkster. I'm the Director for Future Conflict and Cybersecurity here at IISS, and I'll be chairing this discussion on the challenges and possibilities presented by the Colombian peace process, which, assuming it does come to a successful conclusion, will mark the end, as we all know, of one of the world's longest running insurgencies. It is an insurgency with which we at IISS, we at IISS have taken a very close interest over the years. We've written about this insurgency, in particular our dossier on the FARC files, which I think probably is the first ever publication to show the functioning of an insurgent come terrorist group in more or less real time. We've also written about the challenges of the international drugs trade in terms of its impact on the security and stability of countries like Colombia. And last year we organised the Cartagena Dialogue, which brought together policymakers and thinkers from around Latin America and from the Asia-Pacific region to look at Colombia as a country at a time when it was already, I think, apparent that the situation there was starting to shift in what felt like more favourable directions. We'll be looking in detail, self-evidently, at the implications of the process that is currently unfolding, and we have four speakers who, in their different ways, are very well placed to do this. I'll introduce them in the order in which they will be speaking. We will start with the Colombian ambassador to the UK, His Excellency Nestor Osorio. I will ask him to set out the situation from the Colombian perspective. I will then turn to my colleague, Antonio Sampaio, Research Fellow for Latin America, who will talk about some of the peace and development issues pertinent to this particular conflict. Then I'll turn to Gwen Berniet, who has been conducting extensive field work in Colombia for what one might term an on-the-ground perspective. And then finally, Dr. Samir Puri from King's College London, the author of a new and as yet unlaunched Adelphi book entitled Fighting and Negotiating with Armed Groups. That book will be launched here at IISS in September, and if any of you are interested in getting it, can be acquired from any good IISS website. And he will provide some conceptual conclusions about how this fits into the broader issues of dealing with these kinds of long-running and intractable conflicts. Each of our speakers will talk initially for a maximum of 12 minutes. We will then open up the floor for discussion. The entire proceedings will be on the record, and there will be an audio recording made available on the website if anyone is interested. So without any further ado, I will turn to our first speaker, His Excellency the Colombian Ambassador. The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you very much. It's very kind of you, and my gratitude to the Institute for organizing this event. You have always been very close to Colombia and supporting different activities of immense value to us. As you will recall, it's almost 4 years since this peace process started to be formally engaged in Colombia. And I will underline the mention of formal, because for the first time in all the attempts that we have had for the last 30 years about trying to engage with the rebels group, mainly with FARC, they have failed, and they have failed because, I would say, lack of preparation, lack of clarity about the contents of this declaration. And President Santos and the negotiating team that he installed to conduct this process was very careful in learning the lessons from previous failures and difficulties, and trying to be very clear, as you will have seen in the different documents, about what the negotiation is about. It was not an open-ended agenda. It was not about changing the nature of our democratic foundations. It was about specific issues. That's why for 7 or 8 months there were secret talks that were about what the agenda was going to be. And 5 main points were devised or were established concerning rural development, political participation, solution to the problem of illicit drugs, the management of victims, and how the end of the conflict really was going to be. So I think the government and the FARC approached this negotiation in a very committed way to go to one to other of the points of the agenda, and started to evacuate along the months and now years of negotiations the different issues under the principle that nothing is negotiated until everything is negotiated. But the progress has been very consistent, and I would say that the way it has been conducted has led to very important achievements, not only in terms of laying the foundations of what the peace in Colombia could be achieved and how a post-conflict grounds could be developed, but also in introducing institutions that have been completely alien to our system and very, very modern in terms of how the world could appreciate, for instance, a system of transitional justice as the one that the FARC and the government agreed. You will remember that the starting point of FARC in this negotiation was that the only criminal act that they have committed was a political one. And in consequence of that, they have been fighting a system that they didn't agree with. And the only exit at the end of any peace process for them will be the total amnesty of what they have done, because they consider it was only political crimes. The reality was another, as you know very well, because different type of crimes have been committed, and this negotiation about establishing this transitional justice was a very difficult one, but a one in which, at the end, there is a system that includes the creation of a special tribunal with a legal specification about years of conviction, how we will get there, how the different chambers that will integrate that transitional system of justice is going to be integrated. This is to say, a very sophisticated case of transitional justice, and I can tell about this. I was for 2 years the representative of Colombia in the Security Council of the United Nations. I have the opportunity to study different types of transitional justice, and this is one of the most, if not the most achieved one that we have seen. And at the United Nations, this is now considered a model that could be taken into consideration. So this is one of the most important areas to be considered at this very moment. As we talk, this is one of the issues that the negotiation is engaged on, is how the tribunal is going to be constituted, how the judges are going to be elected, for how long this court is going to work, and the clear division about crimes committed that will be subject to punishment. So this is a very clear response to the appeals of the public in Colombia that there should not be impunity. And we are convinced that the system guarantees there is no impunity. We cannot ask the guerrilla to sign and go all of them to jail. That is not rational in a peace process. But we need to establish what kind of crimes and who are the responsible for the commission of the commission of these crimes, and what kind of penalties are going to be infringed. As you know as well, this is the first peace process in which the International Court of Justice issue from the Rome Statute is in place. So we have a clear vigilance and a clear attention from the ICC that is looking at the process, looking at what's happened, and there are crimes against humanity that will be part of the analysis that this tribunal is bound to do. I think this is a very important point, because in my opinion, one of the most difficult areas to tackle and to really unite our country is how you get this conciliation between asking for reinsertion, reconciliation, pardon, but at the same time implying the need from some accountability and the absence of impunity. So, as President Santos indicated, and we have used this in different presentations, our aim was to get as much justice possible to allow peace to be agreed. So this is you go and you apply justice as much as you can, but there is a limit in which if you try to go too far, then the possibility of peace could disappear. The other very important area that has a tremendous impact, and in the opinion of the FARC, is the center of the negotiation for them, is what relates to rural development and the guarantees that could be given to them about how a big plan of long term is going to be developed in Colombia, not only to allocate land, but also to guarantee that the exploitation of that land, that the result that is obtained, that the technical assistance, that agricultural extension, that the techniques of commercialization is going to be ensured. So this is an area in which, connected with their commitment of eradication of illicit crops, and that is also linked with the demining, there are very concrete agreements on that area. This is what we are going to ensure, that the social order and the objective reasons that could be at the origin of a conflict and that we need to prevent to happen again are necessary to correct. It is how we are going to contribute in that rural area of Colombia that is, as you know, the 2/3 of the country, and in which not only the former guerrillas, but the displaced people that amount to more than 6 or 7 million people. That is a huge problem to be solved. So on these areas are firm agreements, and in these areas the contribution of the international community is going to be very important, with the fund trust that has been created, with the bilateral help aid that we are about to receive. And our commitment here is to, and for this we have created an institutional framework, ministers of post-conflict, different agencies of the country that are going to work on that area to ensure that the right projects are prepared and the destination of the monies is ensured and is not being compromised by any wrongdoing. For the government, there was something that has not been, there was at the center of this negotiation something that was not taken into consideration in any other process, including the Northern Ireland process, which was the victims. How do we deal with the victims? How the relation of the victims and the FARC is established, and how we obtain that the FARC really commit to repair the victims and to help in that process of reinsertion. As a result of that, and as soon as 2012, when the negotiation was starting, the government started to create a framework, the law of reparation of victims and restitution of land, other laws concerning the treatment of women victims of the conflict, and this has been the last week has been ratified, but a very important agreement on the gender focus in the peace agreements, in which in all the areas that have been subject to discussion, gender is going to be considered as the central piece of all this process of reinsertion and all the process of support that the government is giving to the activities related in the post-conflict. So it has to do with the property of the land, it has to be with the access and the formalization of, one of the problems we have is to formalize the ownership of the land, because not only from the guerrillas but from the paramilitaries, there have been a total chaos in which by wrong means land has been robbed from the people. So at the moment we are almost with the full framework of the peace agreement ready. We are in the last 50 meters of the marathon, so I think we are almost there, but there are details. For instance, how do you mobilize, or where do you allocate the residents of the rebels, of the former of the FARC? FARC as an institution, as it is known today, is bound to disappear, and they are going to enter into a process of participation in politics. Yesterday or 2 days ago, 23 areas, rural areas, have been designated as the areas in which this ubication of the people is going to take place, another 8 in other areas, and those are the areas in which the tripartite commission that was created by the United Nations by a resolution of the Security Council is going to start, and already there is a very important group of the observers, of monitors that are in place in the different areas. They are starting to go to the places, and what is the mission of this commission is that this agreement that was obtained on the 23rd of June, the ceasefire, the decommission of arms, and the cease of hostilities is verified. From the moment of the last signature that we suppose is going to take place within the next month or maximum 2, from that day the Commission will start. There are preliminary works that they are doing. The Commission will start, and the rendering of arms will start as well to take place, and in 180 days the whole operation should be completed. So we are thinking about signature between around August, possibilities of a plebiscite, something I didn't mention before, but you know very well about. The President committed himself to convene a public consultation about the peace process. That will take place probably at the end of September, and then will come all the presentations to the legislation about a package that will consolidate all the agreements and all the mechanisms for the post-conflict. So we have to finalize, because I have 1 minute now. We have the initialing of the agreements could take place very soon. Those, once they are initial, then they will go for a consultation to the base of the FARC. Then the Colombian government will organize the package, and then a date will be convened for a final formal signature that we hope it will be a public international event. Once that is happening, the plebiscite will be convened for 1 month, October or something like that, so end of September, October, and then will come the legislative package. So we are very confident that all I'm saying is going to happen. There are always delays, there are always difficulties, but one thing is for sure, that the government and the FARC are fully committed to go through the process and to start a new era in Colombia.
Ambassador, thank you very much for setting out clearly the different milestones in this process. There is a lot I think we can talk about in the question and answer, in particular about how this will play out within Colombia's own internal political process, where it's clear that views on this particular exercise are not entirely unanimous, but perhaps we can come to that in the Q&A. I'll now turn to Antonio.
Thanks. Indeed, I share with the ambassador the sense that the FARC as an armed institution will cease to exist, which is quite a momentous occasion because the fight has been going on for 52 years. So we are now reaching probably the last few days or weeks of the armed conflict officially, and actually the fight itself, if it holds, and if, as we expect, the yes wins in the referendum, effectively the armed conflict has already ended. So we saw last month the last day of the conflict between the government and the FARC, which was the 23rd of June. And so far, FARC has about 8,000, less than that now, so let's say 7,000 men and women at arms. And just the first front, which operates in the south, has announced that it will not demobilize, and that carries 400 people. So even if they remain adamant at not demobilizing, which is by no means a certainty, then FARC, as we know it, will cease to exist very soon. So I want to go through some of the non-political factors playing within the rural areas, specifically the issue of illegal economies, which I think may be the main factor driving dissidence or recidivism within demobilized guerrillas. I just want to say from the outset that I am, cautiously optimistic. As I said, I think that FARC will not cause the sort of problems that it has caused in the past decades. But in the literature surrounding recidivism and overall non-compliance with the mobilization, disarmament, and reintegration processes, DDRs, issues related to economic incentives and illegal economies are some of the factors influencing the decisions of individual fighters to go back to illegal activities. And this is certainly a factor playing in the Colombian context. So on one hand, we have plenty of room for optimism because the cohesion and the discipline displayed by FARC in the past few months and years has surprised many analysts, myself included. So despite the difficulty in keeping a command and control structure that keeps dozens of guerrilla fronts in line, plus the communications challenges in the Colombian countryside, in the rural areas, despite all of that, FARC mostly respected the unilateral ceasefires that it has set in the past few years. The conflict dropped to its lowest level ever last year. Despite some violations, it remains at extremely low levels. And just to give you an example, in the past 5 months of last year, when after the last period of unilateral ceasefire began to be implemented, just 6 violations by the FARC of the ceasefire were registered, which is remarkably low, given that FARC has 7,000 guerrillas. So the prospect of FARC adherence to a peace agreement and DDR looks quite promising. The alternative scenario is guided by FARC's profound involvement with illegal economies, which describes a variety of activities controlled by non-state armed groups. And in Colombia, it is mostly the main activity remains coca cultivation, but we also have illegal gold mining or informal gold mining, and the trafficking of legal products such as gasoline, but through illegal means. So this term illegal economy seems a bit academic, but in the context of Colombia, as some of you might know, it is a term that is actually very popular, and the press and the media themselves, they constantly talk about this, thanks to this long-standing marriage between insurgency and criminality there, which goes back many years. So in this scenario, illegal economies would provide a strong incentive for factions not to demobilize, and actually can eventually lure some of the fighters that do choose to demobilize back to armed activity through organized crime. This is not such a far-fetched scenario, first of all, because of historic precedent. The demobilization of the right-wing paramilitary groups during the 2000s resulted eventually in the dissidence of 22% of all demobilized fighters, which, by the way, is below global standards. But when we look solely at commanders, people at the command positions, we see that dissidence was 60%, which in part explains the rise of organized criminal groups such as Los Urabeños, which are now being called sometimes as neo-paramilitary groups. And second, as a recent article at the Journal of Conflict Resolution has pointed out, proximity to organized criminal structures is one of the main factors driving recidivism among demobilized guerrilla groups in Colombia. And this is in line with evidence of crime-bound movements of former terrorists and insurgents in places as diverse as Peru, Bosnia, and South Africa. And regardless of the optimism that we have about FARC, there is ample evidence that these illegal economies now represent a strategic threat to Colombia as it tries to reassert its presence in rural areas, as the ambassador mentioned. And some of these areas have so far had little contact with institutions other than the military or the police. In the past few years, even as military victories were having a significant effect on reducing FARC activity, these illegal economies remain strong. So in the case of coca cultivation, the numbers go up and down, and currently between 2013 and 2014, we saw 44% growth in coca cultivation in the Colombian countryside. Illegal mining has also been a significant source of revenue for these armed groups. And so I just want to wrap up with a glimpse of the challenges to come that I think is the Catatumbo region near the Venezuelan border. Not only because it is a bastion for the National Liberation Army, the ELN, which remains operational despite having nominally joined the peace process, but because it is an underdeveloped rural area where a variety of armed groups, not only the ELN and the FARC, but also criminal groups and a guerrilla group called the EPL, the Popular Liberation Army, operate, cooperate, negotiate, and sometimes fight, having these illegal economies underlying all of that, especially coca cultivation. An example of that is the case of a journalist working for the Spanish newspaper El Mundo, who was kidnapped in May while working on a report about illicit crops in that area. And later, 2 journalists who went to report on her disappearance disappeared as well. They were also kidnapped, it turned out, by the ELN. And another reason why I think Catatumbo illustrates, so the Catatumbo is near the Venezuelan border in the northeast of Colombia. Another reason why I think it's a good example of the future challenges for Colombia is the strategic role it plays in the globalized supply chain of the illegal economies. So the reason why so many armed groups choose to operate there without causing a major criminal war between them is that they play different roles. So criminal groups tend to be stronger in coastal and urban areas of Colombia, especially northern areas, where they ship the supplies produced in guerrilla-controlled territories, to the north, to the world's largest consumer of drugs, the United States, or sometimes to Europe as well. During the FARC peace talks, a major preoccupation of police and military authorities that we talked to in our visit to Colombia is this movement of criminal groups into the vacuum to be left by FARC, which is another risk. And FARC itself became a major player in this field. It acknowledges involvement with extortion of businesses in its territories, but has resisted claims of direct involvement with the drug trade. And part of this involvement may not be openly encouraged, but tolerated by the central leadership, the central secretariat, given the degradation of its ideology among younger but increasingly powerful local level commanders. And the reason why we got to this stage is that the intense is partially a result of the victory of the Colombian institutions and military. The intense campaign supported by Plan Colombia during the 2000s reduced by half the number of FARC troops during the last decade. It also depleted the pool of long-standing mid-level FARC commanders sharing in the original Marxist-Leninist ideology, allowing younger and less ideological members to rise to command posts. On top of that, these younger leaders benefited from increasing autonomy as part of a strategic review conducted by the then leader Alfonso Cano in 2008. The plan carried the very symbolic name of Plan Rebirth, returning to the roots of what a guerrilla means, with smaller, more autonomous units using hit-and-run attacks rather than more ambitious strategies of going frontally against the state forces that had been previously the strategy of the FARC. And the strategy succeeded in some extent by allowing the group to gradually increase the number of attacks it launched on security forces. On the other hand, rumors began circulating of increasing indiscipline in these autonomous fronts, with intelligence that was released on open source of difficulties in keeping the communications with the fronts, and some of these fronts, autonomous fronts, staying for months and sometimes years without direct contact with the Central Secretariat. So to finalize, these changes, I think, set the background for increasing involvement with illegal economies by these FARC fronts, including activities that the Secretariat might not openly recognize or might not openly permit, but that the rank and file might still have control of. So I'll end there.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Antonio, highlighting one very important factor in this whole process, the risk, the phenomenon of what in academic circles is referred to as conflict entrepreneurs in Northern Ireland used to be referred to as ordinary decent criminals to distinguish them from those with a more ideological motivation. But this is certainly going to be one of the big challenges that the whole process will confront going forward. I'd now like to turn to Gwen to give us an on-the-ground perspective on what all of this looks like and what it means. Gwen.
Thank you very much. I'd like to talk about civil society participation, both within the peace process so far and also within the coming post-conflict. And I think it's useful to maintain that separation because most people in Colombia have now caught up with the notion that one thing is the signing of the final agreement between FARC and the government and the ending of an armed conflict that's been going on for longer than 5 decades. And another thing is building a new society which will require the effort of all sectors of society in the implementation of the agreements and also a cultural change in order to prevent future spirals of violence. Having said that, the 6-point agenda that the ambassador has referred to is not simply how to demobilize one of the main armed groups, illegal armed groups. It's also addressing major structural issues that need to be resolved also in terms of preventing future violence. So I think I just want to flag up 3 strengths in terms of participation so far. The first being, as Ambassador Osorio mentioned, the participation of victims and putting victims at the heart of the whole process. There are, according to the latest government figures, over 8 million people registered as victims of the internal armed conflict. And bringing victims to the negotiating table in Havana to give testimony to the different negotiating sides as to what they've been through and say, sort of, your side did this to me, your side killed my son or displaced me from my home, my land, but also have the chance to have input as to what they thought peace should be about, was heralded as conflict in the conflict resolution field as paradigm changing, building on many international experiences of peace processes, but going even further, I think. So that's really positive. And also, as Ambassador Osorio has mentioned, the recent announcement of the termination of the work of the Gender Subcommission, which has been going on for the last 2 years, has also involved consultation of 18 women's groups from Colombia to talk about how gender should be transversalized in the implementation of all the agreements. So those are really positive examples of how participation has happened in the process. And the other thing that I think is worth mentioning on the agreement on agrarian reform, there is a concept that peace needs to be carried out with a territorial approach, which recognizes the extreme diversity of the problems in Colombia according to very different geographical, cultural, historical dynamics. And this idea of a territorial approach emphasizes the importance of consulting with local communities about their development needs, about what they need in terms of infrastructure, civil government presence, schools, hospitals, in order to have the conditions to prevent future cycles of violence. And there have been a series of regional forums that have already been underway, in which the High Commissioner for Peace had allied with Colombian NGO Red Pro de Paz. This is an example of new alliances with government and NGO sector, going to regions in which the NGO has a lot of experience working in and talking to people and hearing about what they think is going to need to be done. So I think that's really important in terms of precedent setting. But I think I also want to talk about how challenging participation is going to be in the post-conflict period in order to successfully implement many of the agreements in many of the most damaged by conflict regions. In many parts of Colombia, there has been either weak or absent civil state presence, and this, of course, has allowed for the emergence of the illegal economies that Antonio has been talking about. In many parts of the country, the state itself has been either directly or indirectly responsible for human rights violations. There have been, of course, many cases of corruption and politicians being involved in paramilitary groups, and even allegations of some lower-level police officers being engaged in the illegal economies and drug trafficking and so forth. And also, as Antonio said, in many regions of Colombia, the main presence of the state is with the military. So in these kinds of regions, which I've got a lot of experience working in, what you see is a deeply rooted mistrust of the state that has to be taken seriously in order to be able to engage local communities in those sorts of scenarios where what you want to do is build civic trust and build a more healthy relationship between state and civil society in order to prevent people from going off into these illegal activities. And these deeply rooted historical narratives hinge on several issues. I think it's worth remembering at this point that one of the particularities of the Colombian context is that there is no black and white before and after transition like there would have been in a dictatorship to a democracy. It's been a slow, gradual change. And President Santos was Uribe's candidate, he was his defense minister, and so in the perception of many Colombians, it's very difficult to appreciate the change that has been undoubtedly been going on over Santos' administration, especially given that under Uribe's government, the official discourse was not about an internal armed conflict, but it was about an internal terrorist threat. And one of President Santos's first actions was to discursively address this and say, actually, this is an internal armed conflict, which meant that he could then recognise FARC as a political antagonist who could be negotiated with, which has, of course, led to where we are today. This is hard for people to grasp because they are on the ground seeing the constant actions of the military, who are the same people in many cases as before. One of the issues that the historical mistrust hinges on is the perception that there is still links between paramilitary groups and the Colombian armed forces. Now, this may in some regions still be the case, and it is definitely in other regions not the case anymore. I think, again, it's worth emphasising that what you're seeing within the armed forces in Colombia is a gradual process of internal transformation of practices but also of discourses where there have been previously frequent accusations of involvement in human rights violations towards an armed forces which is much more aware of the role that they must play in peace building and their protagonism in peace building and the need to create a collective identity in which they have a good relationship with civil society. So this perception of the links with paramilitary forces is something that has to be taken very seriously. There are also other issues to do with the clashes between local and national level perceptions of development and what development means, and fears that many communities have that the government is going to unilaterally impose extractive mining, which is one of the cornerstones of the economic model of President Santos, without taking into consideration what they think. And that's certainly a fear that many communities have. And I think what I want to underline is that participation is an issue for security. Because if communities don't see state presence as protection, but see it instead as danger, then it's going to be very difficult to implement the protection aspects and security aspects of the Havana agreements. And it will also be difficult because civil society will not be able to be used as a reliable feedback mechanism for monitoring the transitions within the Colombian army, for monitoring their improvements, for monitoring their transparency and improvements in corruption, because if the historical narratives are constantly not being revised, and if they are constantly, oh, well, they're all the same, it's a paramilitary state, they're not going to change, they're never going to change, we don't believe in them, then that's not going to be useful for people who are trying to monitor what the changes are actually being. So I think the message I would like to get across there is that it's incredibly important to build dialogue between civil society and the military in order to implement the security aspects of the agreements, and increase also and strengthen the civil state presence in these areas where mostly what people have seen is the military. And I think this should definitely be a focus for the mechanism of monitoring and verification, which is going to have an international component, which was agreed last month. And because many of these communities trust the idea of the international community more than they trust the idea of the state, I think the international community has a responsibility to facilitate an exit strategy eventually. I mean, the international community has got to help communities trust the state, if not more than, at least as much as they trust discursively the international community. Ultimately, that's the goal of functioning rule of law. And I think just to finish, I think I am concerned about the plebiscite, partly because being British, we've just had rather, being British and European, I should add, is rather...
Thank God you mentioned it, because...
Yeah, no, well, I think it's important because I think we have seen how much traction narratives of no and hatred can have. And I think, there are various serious differences between the Colombian situation and the British situation, but I have seen on the net absolutely absurd narratives that are fueled by emotions, fueled by misinformation, which support a no, and I think that has to be taken seriously. And if anyone can play a role from the international community or from the Colombian community outside of Colombia in helping Colombians to understand better what they're voting for, then that's really important. And I think local communities are, again, hard to engage because of the mistrust, but I really hope they will also come out and actually vote in the plebiscite, because it all hinges on this, I think, at the moment. So I'll leave it there.
Gwen, thanks very much. That final point very much reinforces the point that I made earlier, that in terms of Colombia's internal political dynamic, it would perhaps be a mistake to view this prematurely as a done deal. It's certainly true that the United Kingdom and Colombia have many differences. A key one is we can't grow coffee. I will now turn to Dr. Samir Puri to give us some of his thoughts on how this particular process fits into a wider dynamic of conflict resolution.
Yeah, thank you. To pick up from Nigel's introduction, I'm just going to hold up the cover of the book, partly because the actual image is of some relevance. You may not all be able to make it out. The picture of the gentleman shaking hands is the now well-distributed photo of Santos and Jimenez with Raul Castro looking over them. But the more important point is the use of the yin-yang as the overarching symbol, which we have a picture of a gun on one side and a picture of a handshake on the other. And I think we've heard the term used a fair bit already. It's not black and white, it's not binary is a term I'd use. One of the most misleading, I think, notions and tendencies we can have is to judge the nature of a scenario by the manner of its end. This is where our eyes are drawn to. And this is, I think, very wrong, because depending on where you look in terms of Colombia's 5 decades, and especially the last year or so, last couple of years, you can either see a trust-building exercise in peace, or you can see the imposition of a victor's peace and of a military victory. And I think, to pick up on Gwen's point, different people inside of Colombia will be seeing different things depending on where they look, depending on what their experiences are of the story to date. So, I would never, of course, verge on using sort of casual analogies from other conflicts. In fact, the entire point of the book is to be very careful in trying to extrapolate examples from other parts of the world. But I think to illustrate what I can only describe as a human tendency towards revenge and the possible triumphalism that can flow from that, I think Sri Lanka is a very good example. Some people now hold this up as a decisive military defeat, and in a world in which we're awash with conflicts with armed groups that seem to have no end, it's not that people are saying there is a Sri Lanka solution. I think those who aspire to maybe achieving a decisive result with no compromises on the battlefield would, of course, have this as a precedent. Conversely, for the last 10-15 years, since the Good Friday Agreement, the way in which the Northern Ireland conflict was contained and was basically brought to a manageable and then almost zero level of violence, seen as a paradigm in the ameliorative sort of trust-building process of two sides that were formerly at war being able to, under the auspices of wider political reform, and let's not forget, with Northern Ireland, it's a conflict that began in the UK's era of colonisation and decolonisation and ended in the era of devolution. Now, some questions have been thrown up recently, of course, by Brexit and what that will do to the nature of the border between the Republic and the north of Ireland. But nonetheless, if you take Northern Ireland and you take Sri Lanka, and let's oversimplify for a moment, and let's think about the sort of the elements of the human spirit that each one sort of is an emblem for. Northern Ireland and Sri Lanka, of course, are very contained geographical spaces, hugely complex in their own rights, 3+ decades in each case to reach a particular endpoint there. But because they are so contained, in relation to Colombia, Sri Lanka and Northern Ireland appear to be almost like Petri dishes, if one is to take this comparative approach. Let's just pause and reflect on the scale of the Colombian conflict. In time, 5+ decades, and in terms of human loss of life, the figures I quoted from a couple of years ago put it at 220,000. That's nearly 250,000 people who've lost their lives over the course of those 5 decades, from all sides, in all contexts, related to armed group violence. And in Northern Ireland, I think it's 3,500 to 4,000 people that lost their lives. And anybody who knows anything about that conflict will know how difficult implementation of Good Friday has actually been, how liable it has been to being disrupted by wider events, by the fact that people who were formerly at war with each other are being asked to share power with each other. So let's pick up this theme about managing the mix, as I illustrate here, between fighting and negotiating, and reflect a little bit on what Colombia has done very well, as opposed to previous times. What Colombia has done very well, and these mixes are often managed by accident, not necessarily by some kind of design, is that continuity between the Uribe and the Santos period. As Gwen rightly points out, Uribe had Santos as his defence minister, and therefore Santos was, better than anybody acquainted with the military drive to put pressure on the FARC. I think the Colombian establishment's preference has always been, if it can't eradicate the FARC, to negotiate from a position of relative strength, a position of having pushed the FARC into a position of relative vulnerability. The loss of several FARC leaders over the last decade or so, the loss of a lot of FARC control over certain rural areas, have certainly managed to tip that balance in favour of the Colombian military. Another interesting continuity that hasn't been picked up is the post-9/11 US attitude to the Colombian military. Of course, the war on drugs has got a long and tainted history. Back before 2001, of course, stretching back decades. What the US did, however, after 9/11 was to increase the amount of support it gave the Colombian military. This plus other factors, I think, have helped the Colombian military become a more effective responder to the fact that the guerrillas were being pursued into the rural areas, including in the early stages of the Havana talks as well. It's not as if one element of the state response suddenly stopped and the other one took precedence. It's always about making sure that you're changing the emphasis in a way that's reflective of the situation, which is very dynamic and unpredictable. So the FARC may well cease to be a group, but what we should really think about is the fact that the post-conflict and conflict binary distinction can also be very misleading. And one better way of thinking about it is that what Colombia is about to experience is a transformation in a 5-decade-long relationship which has been defined by bargaining and bloodletting between the Colombian political establishment, the Colombian military, and those who have been in the FARC and have had their lives affected by the FARC. There's no way you can press the reset button on these things. And that is why, when it comes to implementation, whilst the chess game of negotiations is useful to think about how Havana has been approached, really implementation does sit at that civil society grassroots level, absolutely. And here there are innovations, not to go on to what Gwen talked about, in terms of, for example, engaging the Colombian diaspora and getting their buy-in into the way in which the Havana talks progress. These are all really positive things, actually. But implementation, of course, is going to be extremely difficult because of, I think, the shape of this conflict. Think about Northern Ireland, think about Sri Lanka, think about how relatively contained they are. And if you can imagine a picture of Colombia and then plot the areas of FARC activity, they're disconnected. There's parts in the north and the east, near Medellin. There's parts in the south, which have been the site of some of the most intensive battles in the last decade or so. So the chances of recidivism are, I think, increased by the fact there are geographically disconnected portions of this insurgency, soon hopefully to be former insurgency. And, of course, the international component is something that, in the 10 conflicts I look at, is actually decisive in overcoming some of the weaknesses and the complexities of the problem that governments deal with. And I just want to dwell very quickly on a couple of these factors, one of which, of course, is the behaviour of Colombia's neighbours. One of FARC's commanders was, in fact, killed in a cross-border raid a few years ago, which, of course, provoked a huge diplomatic outcry at the time. We are luckily in an era that's beyond the sort of era of Chavez. And Chavez, of course, tried to insert himself as a peacemaker at a point at which Colombia's strategy was actually weighted towards fighting. And there was no, of course, reception there for him. But of course, a degree to which the neighbours can be either witting or unwitting hosts to insurgents is a key factor upon which these sorts of conflicts can be either resolved or fail to be resolved. International observation. My previous job last year, before being an academic, was as a ceasefire observer, nowhere in Latin America but in Ukraine. So again, speaking from a bit of personal experience in terms of what it's like being an international placed in someone else's conflict, with a job to impartially report on often ceasefire violations, because it's not like the war will stop just like that. There will be criminality, there will be misunderstandings, there will be provocations. One of the things that these sorts of enterprises turns on is the host government's ability to plan, prepare and house the mission. and then to deal with the fact that an international presence is often accused of being biased towards that host government. Those are inevitable features and characteristics of how this is likely to play out optimistically in years to come. Once again, to pick up on the ambassador's point, if indeed good planning is going to be one of the things that distinguishes this period from past periods, these are things that can be thought about now. Because it's not about waiting for a catastrophe or a setback, it's knowing what to do when they come, because they will come eventually or inevitably from splinters, from misunderstandings, from whatever. So just to round off with a few comments on optimism versus pessimism. I think it's fair to say that the world right now, if you're thinking about armed conflict, is in dire need for some optimism. And as a result, there's the possibility that internationals and people who are casual observers might seize upon the manner in which Colombia has moved itself to getting out of dead ends that arguably it had put itself in the past, with a degree of too much optimism. There is, of course, call for caution. I think that comes across from all the comments, all the panel members here. And, the battle really is about implementation. And ultimately, this hinges on, as I say, and to repeat my point again, a transformation in that relationship between a part of the Colombian establishment and the military and those who have been associated with FARC violence. And to end on a pessimistic note, I picked up from the news this week that in El Salvador, which is not a conflict I feature here, but geographically speaking, proximity, it's quite relevant. July the 13th, the El Salvador Supreme Court struck down an amnesty law that helped secure peace after 12 years of civil war. The law enacted in 1993 is unconstitutional, the court said, because it prevents victims of atrocities from seeking justice. Many Salvadorians fear that justice will come at the expense of political stability. Now, again, this is not something that's resolvable, and as Henry Kissinger said about statecraft, a lot of international security affairs is indeed about the trade-off between justice and stability. You cannot wantonly pursue one at the expense of the other. You simply won't achieve anything. And this is where I think the ambassador is absolutely right, to conceive of this as a balance. And there is pragmatism that needs to be used to bring Colombia forward in the years and decades to come. But that pragmatism has to, I think, deal with a lot of, I think, very uncomfortable truths and a lot of hurt and a lot of anger that will inevitably start to rise to the surface.
So, thank you very much indeed for wrapping that up and setting it in the broader context. It's certainly the case. I think nobody would dissent from the fact that we are in the market for a bit of good news at the moment, and in the overall scheme of things, the Colombian case looks more like good news than not. Though, as our four speakers have ably demonstrated, there are and will likely remain for some considerable time to come significant pitfalls to the implementation of this process, and some of this is perhaps an area that we can go into in the discussion, for which we've got just over 25 minutes. So I invite you to raise your hands, and if you have any queries, preferably brief and ending in a question mark. And before asking a question, could you please, for the record, tell us who you are and what your affiliation is? The gentleman in the penultimate row there.
Well, good morning, everybody. I'm Pablo Moreno, student at War Studies from King's. I wanted first to thank everybody in the distinguished panel. Thank you very much for your insights. My question is about security sector reform. FARC has always wanted to downsize, reduce, or change the structure of the military in Colombia, but the government has been adamant in not allowing that in the table. But still there has to be some plans of security sector reform going on within government. We all know it's very important that you have a proper security sector reform to implement the peace process, to ensure enduring peace. What would you think is the proper way that the government should pursue some tweaks or maybe major security sector reform, and focusing on what exactly?
Yeah, Ambassador, that's probably one for you in the first instance.
Yes, I think that is a very important area to consider, because it's very much into the plans of the post-conflict. And the High Commissioner or High Advisor of the President for the post-conflict has a specific section working together with the Minister of Defense about what is going to be the new strategy and the new way of improving and securing the safety and the security of the people and of to start with, of the guerrillas. One of the problems at the end of the agreements and to get the signatures is that the guerrillas say we need some protection before we enter into the participations of politics. So this is one area that is important, and some special provisions are being taken there. The other one is how, if we are not fighting a guerrilla, then, as it was mentioned here by Mr. Puri, the possibilities of guerrillas that do not enter into the scheme, that become common criminals, that some of them have said, this business of drug trafficking is so good, why are we going to abandon it? So then this is the problem that the guerrilla has inside, but becomes the problem of the national security. And part, and I can tell this, of all the international assistance that we are asking and we are getting, and the plans we are devising, is in that area with the United Kingdom, that has assisted us very much in terms of security. Now we are working on a scheme about how to redirect and how to enter in this new area. So this is a subject that is very much into consideration.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Antonio?
Very quickly, just to transmit what we gathered from previous trips to Colombia, in which we talked to the defense ministry and to some security authorities. Basically, the shape of what the security strategy for the post-conflict is in terms of dealing with these potential spoilers and a variety of non-state armed groups is already set out, and in some cases already implemented, because for many years now, since FARC went to this decentralization strategy, the armed forces revised their strategies and implemented the task forces, of which Task Force Omega is the most well-known example, that are extremely mobile. They are relatively low in numbers, but high in technology, high mobility through helicopters and riverine capacities to move through the Colombian countryside, and very integrated with the police, even with prosecutors to deal with these hybrid armed groups that operate in Colombia. And the armed forces have already released their strategic review for the future, in which they set out that yes, organized crime will be an important component of its responsibilities for the future. And from our talks there, it seems that the armed forces see the scenario of involving itself in activities anti-organized crime in the rural areas, whereas the police will be conducting law enforcement in the urban areas. So that is to avoid the sort of filling the vacuum of the FARC in those rural areas. So in many ways, the security strategy is already in place, but yeah, we'll have to wait and see how clearly we can differentiate common criminals from, law enforcement situations that will, just the police will do, or situations, the military actually may, because that's a dilemma that, faces many post-conflict countries in Latin America.
Just one very, very quick anecdote that I cite in the book. In early 2014, Santos removed the Armed Forces Chief of Staff, Leonardo Barrero, after he resisted investigations into so-called false positives, passing off villagers who might have been killed in a firefight as members of the FARC. That's really important. It's obviously, I don't want to decontextualize that change of personnel, but the consequence then of putting General Pablo Rodriguez, who's fought in the anti-FARC operations, but understands and publicly said that the military's role is to buttress the peace process and bring the state closer to peace and guarantee the process afterwards. It all starts at the high command level, and it cascades down, as anybody who's served in sort of a hierarchical structure will intuitively understand. That, I think, is a really important part of security sector reform in guaranteeing the peace in the longer term.
Yeah. No, it's a very good point. It's noteworthy that when Freddy Padilla was head of the army, we saw what can be characterized as pretty much a sea change in attitude towards human rights on behalf of the Colombian armed forces, and that leadership can make a real difference. There was a gentleman also at the back there. Yes, please.
No, it's Jimena.
Oh, sorry. I'm so sorry.
That's all right.
I mean, in my own defense, I can't see very well. Jimena, hi.
Blanco, America's research at Paris Maplecroft. I wanted to ask a question about something that was touched upon, which is the role of the neighbors. And here I'm thinking, the red, pink, maybe now military green elephant in the room that is Venezuela. And what role is instability in Venezuela going to play in the post-conflict scenario, mainly from the point of view of if we're talking about atomization of violence, groups that continue to criminalize, how much are they going to benefit from instability in Venezuela, and maybe an expansion of the illicit economy beyond, obviously gasoline is not an issue in Venezuela, but I'm thinking medicine, food, etc. What are your views on that?
Yeah, thanks very much, Jimena. Yeah, this was something that the book I referred to before, the FARC files, went into in some detail, dissecting, the actually rather complex and highly transactional relationship that Venezuela under Hugo Chavez had with the FARC leadership. Again, I'm not quite sure who to turn to first, but Ambassador, do you have any?
Very brief. It was mentioned here the transition between former President Uribe and President Santos, having been Santos Minister of Defense of President Uribe. When the end of the government of Uribe got in 2010, we were in the worst possible relationship with Venezuela and Ecuador. First, because of the incident in which Raúl Reyes was killed and the computers were retrieved, and then because the proof harboring of Chavez to all the commandos and the guerrillas in Venezuela. And that was very well known, and that was the way that the guerrillas were very highly operative. Is committing crimes in Colombia, trafficking with the drugs, and then refuge in Venezuela. The tone of the relations between Uribe and Chavez and Correa got to a point that even armies were mobilized or threats of mobilizing armies were made. So when Santos arrived to power, the first thing he says, if we continue like that, we are going to war. So he took the initiative from the very, very beginning that a dialogue with Chavez and Correa was necessary. And he invited them to come and to talk, and as early as that month of August, the president was inaugurated on the 7th of August, Correa came to the inauguration of Santos. Chavez wanted to be, and Santos said, no, wait a minute, let's see each other in 3 or 4 days and let's start conversations. And it was like this that the relationship between Uribe and Santos started to deteriorate, because say, how come you are completely traitor to what we were doing, now you are talking to Chavez? And Santos said, yes, I need to talk to him, because I don't start talking to him, never the FARC will be in a position to have a negotiation. And that is the way things started. And then Chavez was, I would say, caught with the hands in the full cane. So here Santos said, I'm not going to denounce you, I'm not going to, because we have all the elements to create, and the Institute here knows very well about that, all the elements to create a big fuss and say, okay, let's start talking, to help us, starting with the very clear basis that our ideology in Colombia is totally different from your ideology in Venezuela. I respect that, you respect that, and let's start this process of peace. This is the point. And now, Venezuela has come to a very complicated situation in which the possibility of a refugees movement to Colombia is a reality. Many years ago, because of the guerrilla, was the Colombians going to Venezuela. Now, in the last 10 days, we have had more than 150,000 people that have come to Cucuta near the border just to buy the bare necessities and come back to the country. So the thing we need to organize now, and the international community needs to help us on this, is how we prevent a humanitarian crisis and how we manage to, there is a limit in which we can assist and receive refugees from Venezuela. The situation in Ecuador is a completely different one, much more normalized and no problem.
No?
A quick word on illegal economies. I mean, I think the changes in the Venezuela-Colombia border will be less related to the peace agreement than to what happens in Venezuela itself, right? Because of this traditional or long-standing absence of institutions and the challenges in keeping control of this area, a agreement will not change the dynamics that are currently driving the illicit smuggling through the borders. And it's difficult to see an even greater increase in these illicit activities there because they are already very intensive. So, yeah, I think migration can play a part in not directly related to the armed conflict in Colombia, but in creating more pressures to municipalities, to the federal government in housing these people, and there are some potential spillover of organized crime in that, but yeah, it's a broad challenge related to Venezuela.
Okay. Yes, sir, and then the lady in the front. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Bruce George, former member of Parliament, 36 years, undefeated. Just talking politics or retired. That's a summary of my career. What should have the international community done better than it did? This is a tiny, tiny country. I know there's a lot of corruption. There's corruption everywhere. But listening, and I must confess, ignorance or near ignorance of the country, even though I've been there. Surely the West, with all of its money, influence, power, etc., could have done something better. But I have no idea what that should have been.
Okay. Anybody want to? Yes, Samir.
A very quick start. I mean, of course, given the 5 decades, given the Cold War paradigm, given the communist routing of the FARC, it's impossible to reinterpret, using our current standpoint, the fairly limited options that especially the US would have had at the time. The US, in retrospect, you can say had a very binary view of the world as of the Soviet Union, but that's because we're sitting here post-Cold War, almost post-Cold War. Pre-Cold War redux, possibly. But I think the idea of the international community being, neutral in that context is, I think, fairly fanciful. I think to bring it up to date now, I think the United Nations are going to have a very big role. I know the UN are doing quite a lot of preparatory work. A friend of mine in UNHQ was telling me about some of the stuff that they're doing, and that sort of thing is really important. Because with multilateral platforms, it's always dependent on which part of the world you're in, which platform is deemed to be the most impartial, deemed to be the most viable. I think in this context, there's the regional organisations potentially, but I think the UN is clearly going to be the most viable platform to achieve neutrality.
But the UN has been around for bloody hundreds of years. Why haven't they done anything?
70 to be precise. Gwen, you wanted to...
It seems long.
I think perhaps on a slightly controversial note, I think the international community has played a really important role in supporting human rights defenders and strengthening civil society in Colombia, and perhaps simplifying the complexity of the armed conflict to such an extent that it's quite difficult to, from the outside, gauge what's been going on. And I think that the role that the international community, international human rights community has got to play now is to recognise the transition that is ongoing and to actually start directing some of the attention that they've been giving to human rights defenders to actually capacitating state institutions and training state institutions. There's been so much attention paid to training human rights defenders in what their rights are, what human rights are, how to lobby the state, that there has a development of a slightly combative framework between civil society and the state, which hasn't helped, I think, the state engage pragmatically with some sectors of the left. And I don't think that's been necessarily a factor in actually prolonging the conflict, but I think it's been a compounding issue that needs to be redressed at the moment.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, Madam.
I'm Begüm Zorlu. I'm coming from Turkey. I've graduated from conflict studies. We are very excited about Colombia and Turkey, many people, and we are following. And we have just opened a website that is translating the documents on Colombia. And we're doing a lot, and we're so excited and optimistic due to the situation. So my question is that what can the international community do for the conflict in Turkey? And the transitional justice articles in Colombia has been very exciting for us, and hopefully it will turn out to be a model that can be seen in every conflict zone. So, from our perspective, we are very excited, and we think it's a success, even if it fails some steps and everything. So, what can we learn for other conflicts?
Okay.
What can we learn?
Well, I think Samir has already issued a note of caution about extrapolating from individual cases, but
I'll do it in one very quick nutshell.
Yes.
Actually, because my 10 case studies are partnered up. Actually, Colombia and Turkey are partnered up, not because of any similarity, but one similarity which is extremely topically relevant, sadly, is that of civil-military relations in these kinds of conflicts. And one thing I noticed historically, we're talking decades ago in Colombia, not recently, as has been the case in Turkey with the PKK and Turkish strategy there, is generals who can impose their will on strategy, monopolise strategy, push out those voices that want to talk about a peace deal or undermine peace deals. Coups, of course, have been a feature in both Colombia and Turkey's histories, again, decades gone by. I would say, very simply, one of the big notes of caution is because of unity of command being important within the state to try to manage that mix between your different instruments. If it's not there, as it's not in Turkey at the moment, and it's in a deep period of crisis, the prognosis is quite poor from that perspective, as well as the regional chaos Turkey has, which, again, just to very quickly go back to the Venezuela question, the border is 2,200 kilometers long. It's very, very long. But Chavez and the FARC probably a decade ago, 15 years ago, saw some kind of anti-Americanism as a bonding factor, maybe even unspoken in how they thought about each other. The fact that isn't a reality, there's problems, of course, across the border, but the fact that isn't a geopolitical reality is hugely important. Turkey, unfortunately, is going to have to bide its time until conditions are more favourable regionally and domestically.
I want to ask a question. Sorry, I'm Philip Barton. I'm a Senior Consulting Fellow here at IIS on secondment from the Foreign Office. I want to ask a question about the role of prisoners and how they're going to be dealt with. Because I think we saw in the Northern Ireland protest that their desire to become free again was actually a driver for peace within the Irish movement. So how in Colombia are you going to deal with prisoners? How are they going to be treated like they're already in prison for the crimes they've committed?
This is also a process that has started some months ago. In fact, 2 months ago, a group of guerrillas that were in jail were taken to, not the tribunal yet, but according to a judge and at the request from the prosecution, they were liberated and let free. And there is now some debate about if still are some civilian people or soldiers of the arms of Colombia in the hands of FARC. There is a very hot issue, which is one of the guerrilla leaders, Simon Trinidad, who is detained and condemned in the United States. So here, this is playing a role about the full liberation of people, but the government has announced and is committed that prisoners will be liberated, and everyone who is in the hands of the guerrilla will be liberated as well. I think that here we have something to add to the geopolitical situation. As we mentioned, the conditions for the FARC today are much more different as they were 10 years ago. And Cuba, in one side, who has been one of the sponsors of this process, is in a complete new, different path in terms of approaching the international community, reestablishing and normalizing the relation with the United States. And Venezuela is also in a situation that, unfortunately, economically has collapsed, politically is in a total chaos, so that harboring possibility that the FARC had before of having a refuge in Venezuela is over, or is not a matter for them to be secure about. So this contributes very much at the commitment and the political reality for these people to move. Colombia, in these 10 years, in these 20 years, have maintained an economic development. This tiny country is the third economy of Latin America. The size of the country is the double of France, and the economy has been grown at more than 5% on average for the last 7 years. That thanks to the effort of the Colombians, the investment of the foreigners, Britain included in them, the United States, France, Spain, many countries are heavy investors in Colombia. Maybe one of the reasons this guerrilla lasted so much was because, as in no other country happened, there were the drugs that were fueled by the consumption in the West. That is the big thing to ask about. What didn't the West contribute about? How this managed to be one of the issues that helped to maintain. The guerrillas disappeared in Latin America in the last 20 years. The only one that remained after Castro pushed all the guerrillas to revolutionize Latin America and created dictatorships to the extreme right, Colombia endured this guerrilla and paid a tremendous price because of the drugs. Policemen, judges, everybody was a victim of it. So this tiny country paid the most expensive price in the war against drugs and against guerrillas, because the guerrillas found this refuge in the drug issue.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, okay, there's a lady there on the third row back, yeah?
Gabby Drinkwater from the Latin America Caribbean team at Christian Aid. Without wanting to labour the point about the plebiscite, the referendum, and given what we've heard in some of the responses now from the panellists, I'd be interested to know if you had any opinion analysis on the potential influence of Uribe and his sympathisers on the plebiscite, and also, perhaps conversely to that, how can civil society play a greater role in supporting the plebiscite? And also, without wanting to be pessimistic, does the government of Colombia have a plan B?
Okay, I think we'll make this one ladies first.
Thank you. Well, I think ex-President Senator Uribe and his party, the Centro Democrático, have a huge influence on many sectors of public opinion in Colombia. And I think they've been quite careful in not pronouncing yet what side of the campaign they're going to go for, whether they're going to go for a no, which would be probably quite dangerous in terms of their political capital. As David Cameron found out, it's quite difficult to campaign for a status quo, and would risk turning off, I think, some of their supporters, because it's quite an extremist position to campaign to say no to peace. But I think one of the more interesting actions of Senator Uribe recently has been responding to many calls, both by President Santos and FARC leader Timochenko, to come and participate in the dialogue, recognising his huge influence. He's responded publicly saying he will talk, but only if the negotiating teams are willing to reopen some of the issues that have already been agreed in Havana, including, crucially, the participation of ex-FARC fighters in politics, and basically saying, well, they should all go to jail rather than be in Congress. I think this is a really dangerous thing to say publicly, because it opens the path for many people who are influenceable by his narratives to think that that is a reasonable thing to lobby for, when actually it's not a reasonable thing to lobby for, because this is the product of 4 years of very hard work with all of this international support and expertise, with all of this civil society participation. And there have been many chances for the Centro Democrático to participate up until now in on how to discuss those issues. So to reopen, I think, the agreements with Uribe's input is very dangerous, and he could potentially have a lot of influence over people in calling for that. And I think that the sort of the danger is that if that is not dealt with sensibly by the government, then it could have a bad effect on the plebiscite. I think the government needs to celebrate his change in stance in saying, oh yes, I'm willing to talk. I think that's something that's worth acknowledging and celebrating, but saying that by no means is any Colombian going to be given special treatment in how to have a say on the peace agreements, and he will have to vote, in the plebiscite. So I think it is dangerous. I think the government has been trying to do peace education and to carry out education and pedagogy and communicate to the whole of Colombian society what's been agreed and what are all of the issues involved. But I think there was a very interesting interview with Lord Alderdice, who was one of the Northern Irish experts who visited Colombia in recent months, talking about, yes, it's important to try to communicate with people about what's going on in politics, but ultimately people don't mobilise public opinion based on rational knowledge. They mobilise public opinion based on emotions, and I think perhaps there is a lack of emotional connect with the people of Colombia who are sceptical, and the efforts, the extremely sophisticated efforts, particularly from the Office of the High Commissioner for Peace, to explain what's going on, somehow it's not getting through to the skeptics. So I think there is reason to be cautious, but I also think optimism is very important, and I think it should be celebrated because it's with the infectious optimism of those who are pro-yes that ultimately this is going to follow through.
Okay, I've learned by bitter experience not to ignore the media, so I'll give...
I was going to ask more or less the same question, but let's assume that President Santos wins the plebiscite.
Not the country.
Well,
that is one of the problems.
It's a race head-to-head between President Uribe, who is very popular, and President Santos, despite all his efforts, is not that popular. That is a reality. And my question is, how successful do you think FARC would be politically? Taking into account, for example, M19. M19 was very popular back in the 80s, but FARC is more or less hated by everyone in Colombia. So how successful would they be politically?
Okay, interesting question.
I let that question for you but I want to because I don't want to answer that. The thing is that the decision we are putting to the people of Colombia is historical one and needs the legitimacy. Needs to be as legitimate as possible in order to be a solid historical decision. That's why the president decided from the very beginning, before the negotiation started, to say whatever we negotiate will be submitted to the people of Colombia for them to say if they agree or not. And I think that is democracy in action, and that is a very important approach, with the risks that it has, with the needs for a careful planning about how to do it, what the strategy of campaign should be. And we are very clear now, and the president is very clear. This cannot be a tour de force between Uribe and Santos. There will be the necessary tendency for that to happen. But I hope our advisors in the matter will be clever enough to put not only the question but the campaign as something that is the ownership is the Colombians, not the president of the moment. That is very important. How successful the FARC will be, what do you think about?
Well, yeah, go ahead.
Very quick start. I mean, M19, they contested the 1990 elections. Their political party later faded. They're a much smaller armed group than FARC. But the issue there was that right-wing paramilitaries then hunted and killed many of their former members. And the FARC had a really bad experience in setting up the UP, I think, beforehand as well, which was liquidated by tacitly, I guess, the state had allowed revenge to be the dominant response to their politicisation. So that's where FARC will be in their minds, with those precedents still within living memory. We can be political, but we won't be killed. That's the baseline, I think. So it's very different to, I think, Northern Ireland, where it's astonishing when you think that Martin McGuinness is now one of the most outspoken proponents of EU integration in the UK, actually. He's quite a good one as well, given where he's coming from in the process. But even then, we'll all be familiar with, in the Northern Irish context, the supposed letters of immunity scandal from, I think, about a year and a half ago, which Peter Robertson suffered really badly during, which was, of course, the idea that if you're going to move to peace, we have to pragmatically overlook or somehow work around the fact that people have culpability. They have blood on their hands, maybe 2 or 3 steps removed, and they're now parliamentarians or in the support structure of elected politicians. There's no simple answer to those sorts of questions. But if you're serious about implementing a peace deal, those are the complexities you have to deal with and wrestle with in years and decades to come.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm afraid we've run out of time, so I'm rather reluctantly going to have to draw proceedings to an end. This is an enormously complicated issue that we've been addressing, and inevitably there is much more we could have done. But I think we've, our 4 panelists have done the topic considerable justice in the very limited time they've been allowed. So can I please ask you to join me in thanking them for their time and expertise.